Story 1. My biological maternal grandfather smothered my newborn uncle in retaliation for my grandmother standing up for herself during his abusive tirades. He had been abusive in every sense of the word towards my grandmother and their children, and for the most part my grandmother just took it out of fear. One day she got a bold streak and argued back at him. He stopped arguing, and my grandmother thought maybe he just decided to leave it alone. Later that day, he smothered their newborn son in his cradle and told her if she ever talked back to him again, she would be next. He led the authorities to believe it was crib death, and so it was ruled to be such. Thankfully, my grandmother escaped him some time later. I didn't hear this story until I was an adult. I never met my maternal grandfather, and I'm quite content with that. If I cared enough to know where he was buried, I would go urinate on it. Story 2. My family didn't talk about anything beyond the weather, prices at the grocery store, and light gossiping about other family members. I was 12 when my dad died. No one said his name again, and there were no stories about him. As an adult, I reflect on how pathological the avoidance was. Story 3. My great aunt. She and my grandma, her sister, hate each other so much that I didn't even know she existed until I was 30 and was accidentally shown a picture with her in it. I still don't know why they stopped talking, and grandma is obviously not willing to talk about it at all. The funny thing is, I know my great aunt's children. They're really close to my grandma and come to every holiday dinner. I always knew they were related to me. I just never knew how. Story 4. We all pretend we do not know my uncle is gay. No one has a problem with it at all aside from my uncle himself, who has a lot of shame about his sexuality due to some childhood trauma. So we all pretend we think he is just such a hermit that love is not for him and all he needs is his cabin and his fishing pole. He knows we know, and we know he knows we know, but for now, this is how he feels most comfortable. Story 5. When I was 5, my dad one day took me with him to visit a man about buying a wagon. While they were talking, I went into the backyard to play with the man's grandson. My dad forgot I was with him and just left. He came back 25 minutes later, and that was the very last time my mom let my dad take me anywhere until I was old enough to call home. The biggest plot twist is I'm now married to the grandson. But yeah, my dad hates it if anyone brings up that I got left, so we don't. Story 6. Both my parents cheated on each other. All my aunts and uncles got divorced, but my parents stayed together, drank, and fought, and supposedly that was better. Story 7. My late uncle had schizophrenia or something similar. Things weren't bad enough to force him into treatment, but his mental illness was undeniable. I once asked the family if he had been taken to a doctor to see if there was something diagnosable that he could have been helped with, and you would think I had done something terrible. That uncle is a little weird, and that's the end of that conversation. Story 8. My grandmother sadly had to enter a tuberculosis sanitarium when she still had a handful of children at home. A couple of older siblings moved back home to help raise them. Eventually, my grandfather started seeing another married woman in their small rural community. My mother always said that once her mom learned of the affair, she just gave up and died at the sanitarium. This was about 3 years before the advent of antibiotics that might have cured her. So now grandfather was widowed. His youngest 2 kids moved to town to finish high school by themselves, and the other woman had a baby that was putatively her still husband's child. I don't remember if her husband died or they divorced, but by the time I came along, my grandfather was married to the other woman and had been for decades. He was the patriarch of our very large family, the only grandparent I ever knew, though surely he couldn't have picked me out of a lineup, along with his dozens of other grandchildren. Anyway, this side of the family was fun, gregarious, beer-drinking, Catholic church-attending poker players. Once, during a pretty lubricated family get-together, the affair baby, now a grown woman, said something like, "I just don't know where I belong in this family," because supposedly she was no blood kin to any of us. My lovely drunk Uncle Nick said, "Well, hell, you're our sister." I was about 12. I swear the windows rattled from the seismic release of emotions over what was finally acknowledged. Story 9. Something vague about grandma's sister's husbands were molesters. Made me realize why grandma never talked to them. Also wonder if it's why my mom was super overprotective about going inside friends' houses on the street or play dates and slumber parties of classmates until I was much older. Story 10. My brother was accused of rape by my sister's best friend at the time. It was after a night of heavy drinking, and she says she passed out and woke up to my brother having sex with her. I had no idea about this until many years later when my sister told me why they weren't friends anymore. She told me our dad convinced her not to press charges. She and I are the only two family members who have spoken about it in any capacity. He denied it, of course. Sadly, I wouldn't put it past him. We have a messy family. Story 11. On my dad's side, my paternal grandmother died from complications from diabetes when my dad was in his 20s. My grandfather was dating a woman he knew less than 3 months later. The elephant in the room is that my grandmother, who, to be fair, had mental illness issues, killed herself by putting herself into a diabetic coma after finding out my grandfather was cheating. Story 12. Oh, in my family, it's definitely the mysterious potluck fight of 2016. No one will tell me exactly what happened, but apparently, it involved my aunt's potato salad, my grandma's deviled eggs, and my uncle making a harmless joke that escalated into full-on chaos. All I know is that someone stormed out, my mom ended up crying, and to this day, the phrase potato salad is basically a trigger word at family gatherings. We've all collectively agreed to just pretend it didn't happen, but the tension every time someone brings a dish to share is palpable. Family secrets are so weird, right? Story 13. When I was a teen in the 1960s, no one in my family was allowed to talk about Aunt Rita because she preferred the company of other women. I thought that she was a strong, vibrant, happy woman who never had a bad thing to say about anyone and didn't care what anyone had to say about her. She was really awesome. Story 14. My parents lied for 18 years about who my sister's real dad is. We grew up together, and they always said we shared both parents. No, my mom got pregnant by some random guy across the country, came back, and said she was my dad's kid too. For 18 years. Story 15. My real dad overdosed. Later, my stepdad adopted me, and they had my little sister. My sister has no idea we don't share a dad, and I was never able to discuss the grief of finding my dead dad. Story 16. I have an older sister I have never met. My dad got a girl pregnant in high school and refused to marry her. She gave the baby up for adoption. It was a closed adoption in the 60s, so I would not even know where to look for her. I found out one night years ago when my dad had too much to drink and told me. Both of my parents are now deceased. They would never talk to me about it after that one time. Story 17. When my grandmother was on life support, it came out that she and my grandfather had divorced for a period of time and were set to marry other people, but they left them at the altar and married each other again. This happened when my dad and uncle were in their late teens or early 20s, so they knew about it and were still indifferent when this big secret was revealed. I'm curious. I need the gossip. Story 18. My uncle committed suicide to escape the hatred of the family. He was gay, and their Christian values said to treat him like absolute garbage because of it. After he passed, my grandmother tried to destroy all of his things. They were apparently possessed by demons. I was allowed to know him, though. He was still blood after all. I loved him so much. Now the only memories of him that I have are playing Legos and solitaire in the computer room. I have a few of his things that no one will ever get their hands on. I'll just be over here, hanging with my demonic spoon rest. Story 19. I come from a long line of criminals and murderers on one side, and on the other side there was a child rapist whose case made it to the state Supreme Court. That's what we talk about. Most of the family refuses to discuss how great-grandpa married 2 underage sisters and kept them pregnant. He had 23 kids. Story 20. A good portion of my father's family lived on the same street. My great-aunt never came into my grandparents' house, and I didn't think anything of it until I was older and noticed she'd just stay outside or we'd go to her house to say hello. It turns out my great-grandfather shot himself in the house, and she was the one who found him. No one talks about it, but my mother finally told me in my early 30s. Story 21. Death of family members in general. Specifically, I had an older brother who died when he was a couple of days old. That was 3 years before I was born and 6 years before my sister. My parents took my sister and me to a cemetery one day. I think we were 13 and 11 by then. We walked up to a small headstone, and they explained that we had a brother. That was it. That was the last time he was mentioned by my parents. My sister and I talked about it a few times. They didn't even tell us how he died. When my grandpa died, he was buried 2 plots down from my brother. Neither my mom nor dad said anything. When my mom died, she was buried next to him. I did see my dad standing over his headstone and crying. Actually, now I remember, about a year after my mom died, I had dinner with my dad and finally asked him. Turns out my brother died of a heart issue, and my dad didn't even really know if it was a fluke or if it was congenital. It would have been nice to know. Story 22. Autism. We are all autistic. I am just the one who got my kids diagnosed. I absolutely cannot have that conversation with my mother. She used to have meltdowns over how I was not masking very well. Not the words she would use, of course. Story 23. Hoarding. Especially my mother's. Since it is not as bad as her sisters or sister-in-laws, it is not hoarding. I am sorry, but if you have rooms that are packed full of stuff and the rooms and items in them are unusable, it is hoarding. Story 24. Trigger warning. We don't talk about my older brother who died in prison. He was there because he was a predator who molested children. He had been doing it for a long time before he was finally caught. He deserved to die, and I'm not sorry. Story 25. My grandmother's husband was a pedophile who raped my cousin, which my grandmother was aware of and made my cousin apologize to her husband for tempting him. The pedophile remained in the family for another 20 years and was allowed to babysit us grandkids unsupervised multiple times. But we don't talk about that. It's over and done with. No point in bringing it up, right? Story 26. The fact that my dad beat me as a kid and terrorized me. I, in turn, did the same to my little brother. Mom stays silent every time I bring it up. Story 27. My mom's side of the family, which she completely cut off and stopped talking to shortly after she met my dad and long before I was born. I'm the firstborn, has never been mentioned at all. Story 28. My biological grandmother committed suicide when my mom was only 16. I knew my step-grandmother was my step-grandmother my whole life, and I knew my mom's mother had died long before I was born. It wasn't until I was 10 or 11 that my mom finally told me how her mother died. That's the only time we've really talked about her death. I know that she was a pretty good mom, all things considered, and my mom thought she would have been a good grandmother to me if she hadn't had severe depression when she was in her 40s. We never really bring her up at family gatherings. We don't talk much about my mom and my aunt's childhoods. It's really sad because my step-grandmother was abusive and is the reason why my mom didn't get to see her dad much after I was born. Story 29. The fact that I have 2 half-sisters is because my dad cheated on my mom. My mom knows about one of the girls, not the other. Ancestry DNA for the win. No one says a word because we do not want mom to have to relive that trauma. Story 30. My aunt abandoned my grandmother on her deathbed, leaving my dad to sort out everything. After he did, the only thing she cared about was the money and didn't even try to show up for the funeral. I am deeply upset with Kelly for her hateful and conniving behavior. She won't even talk to her own daughter, my cousin, because she married a black man. They are happily married, by the way. Story 31. My cousin being gay is the worst-kept secret in the family. His immediate family is in complete denial while also not allowing him the freedom to move out or move in with his roommate. Story 32. My grandfather distributed drugs in the 70s. He had a property in Mayfair that was later seized by the police. He was imprisoned for 7 years in the 80s. I found out a few years ago. It's really weird because we are a part of a respectable family with conservative values. Story 33. My blood type doesn't make sense. My mother is B positive, and my father is O negative. I donated blood in college and found out I'm a positive. I brought it up in a casual, "This is interesting, I must be a medical anomaly," way and was immediately and brusquely shut down. I DNA matched to my paternal cousin on Ancestry, but no one else in the family would do a DNA test. There are more questions than answers. Considering I no longer talk to my biological parents or a majority of my family due to other things we don't talk about, like addiction, mental health, and abuse, I doubt I'll ever get an answer. Story 34. My mom's biological dad was an addict, not sure of his drug of choice, abusive, and probably had bipolar 1. After my grandmother finally divorced him, he committed suicide and left a 9-page note detailing how his deceased mother and sister were telling him the truth of the universe or something along those lines. My mom's younger sister skipped school on the day he died and happened to be driving by as the police brought his body out. Story 35. My cousin was the antagonist in an episode of Maury Povich for cheating on his fiancée at the time with approximately 20 women. One of my other cousins kept the video recording secretly and showed me. However, it's been wiped from the internet and is nowhere to be found now. Story 36. My mom had a brother who was a couple of years older than her. From what I've put together, he was autistic and was sent away for electric shock therapy sometime in the 1950s or 1960s, which eventually killed him. We have no idea when he died or where he is buried. My mother apparently found out when her parents casually mentioned it over dinner when she asked how he was doing. My grandfather, with whom I grew up, refused to speak about him. He would change the subject or leave the room if he was asked anything about him. The only evidence we have of his existence is a picture of him and my mother when they were children, and some forms from the hospital he was in describing an episode where he was hitting and scratching the nurses. It's just really sad all around.